They thought the lake belonged to everyone, until one legal notice proved it belonged to me. The old mill lake wasn't flashy, no yachts, no cafes, just quiet water, trees older than the town itself, and a cracked stone mill that hadn't turned in decades. Most buyers overlooked it because it didn't come with amenities. I bought it because it came with something better: clean title, surveyed boundaries, and absolute privacy. The deed was clear: the shoreline, the access road, the spillway, all mine. I didn't rush to announce it. I figured paperwork spoke louder than words. 2 weeks after closing, I noticed tire tracks by the east bank. Not the faint kind left by a fisherman easing down to the water, but deep, careless grooves that chewed through wet soil and crushed reeds that had been standing there longer than any HOA board member had been alive. And at first I told myself it was leftover activity from before the sale, some last bit of use that simply hadn't faded yet. But then came the picnic trash. Paper plates fluttering like white flags of disrespect, soda cans half crushed and shoved into the mud, a greasy paper bag slowly dissolving at the waterline. And that was when the unease settled in my chest, because this wasn't accidental or old. It was fresh, intentional, comfortable, the kind of mess people leave when they believe a place belongs to them. And the final insult came the next morning when I walked the perimeter and saw an HOA branded sign nailed crookedly to one of my trees. My tree bark split and bleeding sap around cheap hardware store nails. The sign reading, "Community Lake Residents Only" in bold, smug lettering, the logo printed clean and official, as if authority could be manifested with laminate and confidence alone. And for a long moment I just stood there listening to the water lap against the shore, feeling the quiet anger rise, because this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a claim, a declaration, an attempt to rewrite reality with a hammer and a log. So I removed it carefully, pulling the nails out and setting them on the stump like returned ammunition. And I carried the sign across the property line and leaned it against their clubhouse fence where everyone could see it, attaching a crisp copy of my deed right to the middle with clear tape, parcel number highlighted, boundaries marked, lake included, my name unmistakable, a silent lesson in black and white that didn't require a meeting or a vote. And as I walked away, I honestly assumed that would end it. That the message was clear, that adults would recognize a line when it was drawn legally and physically. But it didn't, because entitlement rarely dissolves when confronted with facts. It hardens, and over the next days the activity increased rather than stopped. More tracks appeared like someone was daring me to notice. More trash accumulated, as if littering were a form of protest, and neighbors I'd never met before wandered down to the water with coolers and folding chairs, waving casually when they saw me as though I were the guest on my own land. And when I politely told one group they were trespassing, they laughed and said the HOA had always used the lake, and that some paperwork didn't change community tradition. A phrase delivered with the confidence of someone who had never once checked a boundary survey in their life. And that's when I understood that the sign wasn't the problem, it was the symptom, because somewhere in a board meeting or a Facebook group echo chamber, someone had decided that repetition created rights, that long-term misuse became ownership, that confidence could outweigh a deed, and the more I enforced, the more offended they became. Emails started arriving framed as friendly reminders that the lake was a shared amenity. Notices slid under my mailbox door citing bylaws that didn't apply to me, warnings written in bold font with exclamation points, as if punctuation could substitute for jurisdiction, and each time I responded the same way, calmly. Attaching documents, citing recorded plats, keeping emotion out of it, because the law doesn't care how loudly someone believes, it only cares what's recorded. But belief is powerful and belief fuels escalation. So one afternoon I returned to find the sign back on my tree, nailed higher this time, as if elevation added legitimacy, and that was the moment the assumption truly died. The assumption that reason would prevail, that evidence would be enough, that adults would accept being wrong. Because this wasn't ignorance anymore, it was defiance, a quiet test to see how far they could go before I pushed back hard. And as I stood there with the lake reflecting the sky behind that ridiculous sign, I realized they weren't just trespassing on land, they were trespassing on patience. And patience, unlike property, is not unlimited. So I took photos, documented everything: dates, times, tire patterns, serial litterers, saved every email, archived every notice, and I removed the sign again. This time leaving it where it couldn't be missed, directly under the clubhouse flagpole, deed attached, survey map included. A sticky note added that simply read, "Private property." Repeated notice, Not angry, not threatening, just factual, because facts were going to be the spine of whatever came next. And as I drove home that evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees lining the lake, I knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't over, not even close. Because people who confuse access with ownership don't back down quietly. They double down, and the lake, calm and indifferent, would soon become the center of a lesson they never expected to learn. The HOA president showed up mid-morning with a clipboard tucked against her chest, and a smile so carefully practiced it never quite reached her eyes. The kind of smile meant to signal authority while pretending to be neighborly. And she didn't ask permission to step onto my property, just walked up as if access were assumed, heels sinking slightly into the soil near the shore, eyes scanning the lake the way people look at things they believe already belong to them. And she introduced herself with a title before a name, because titles matter deeply to people who lack actual jurisdiction. Then she explained, calmly and confidently, that the lake had always belonged to the community, emphasizing the word always like it was a legal doctrine rather than a vague memory passed around at potlucks. And I listened without interrupting, because letting someone fully state a false premise is often the fastest way to dismantle it. And when she finished, I explained just as calmly that tradition doesn't override recorded property law, that deeds, surveys, and county records don't dissolve because a group has grown comfortable crossing a line. And I could see the flicker of irritation behind her eyes, because she hadn't come for a discussion. She'd come for compliance. And she responded by warning me that residents had rights, her pen tapping lightly against the clipboard as if she were already drafting a violation. And that was when I warned her that rights without ownership are just wishes, words that landed harder than I intended, but needed to be said, because clarity is sometimes mistaken for hostility by people who rely on ambiguity to exert control. And she laughed, not because it was funny, but because laughter is a defense mechanism when certainty cracks. And she said the board would handle it, those words delivered with the weight of an institution that had clearly never been told no before. And as she turned to leave, she added that I should expect formal communication soon, as though paper with a logo could undo a recorded chain of title. And after she left, I stood there watching ripples move across the water, thinking about how confidently wrong she was, how dangerous confidence becomes when paired with authority unchecked by law, and over the following days that confidence manifested in predictable ways. A cease and desist letter slid into my mailbox accusing me of obstructing community access, emails copied to half the neighborhood implying I was hostile and uncooperative, a meeting agenda circulated promising to resolve the lake issue, as if ownership were a scheduling conflict, and every message leaned heavily on phrases like historical use and shared benefit, never once acknowledging the deed I had already provided, because acknowledgement would collapse their entire position. And when I replied, I kept it brief and factual, attaching the same documents, restating the same boundaries, refusing to be drawn into emotional arguments, because emotions can be twisted but records are stubborn, and that stubbornness clearly frustrated them. Because enforcement escalated, notices were posted on the community board warning residents of temporary access restrictions due to a dispute, framing my lawful exclusion as a nuisance rather than a right. And neighbors began stopping me to ask why I was causing trouble, why I couldn't just let things stay the way they were. And each time I explained that I hadn't changed anything, I had simply enforced what already existed, and that explanation was often met with silence, because people don't like confronting the idea that they've been benefiting from something they were never entitled to. And then one afternoon, the HOA president returned, this time with another board member in tow. Their body language tighter, smiles gone entirely, and she informed me that the board had voted to assert community access until the matter was resolved, a statement so legally meaningless it almost felt surreal. And I reminded her that votes don't transfer property, that access without consent is trespass, and that continued entry would be documented. And she responded by saying residents would not be intimidated, a word choice that revealed more than she intended. Because enforcement of law feels like intimidation only to those accustomed to ignoring it, and when she left again, I didn't feel angry so much as resolved, because the line had been crossed from misunderstanding into deliberate overreach. And from that moment forward, every interaction became evidence, every step onto the land without permission another entry in a growing record, and somewhere between the emails, the notices, the warnings dressed up as authority. It became clear that the board wasn't handling anything. They were gambling, betting that I would tire, that pressure would work, that tradition and volume could outlast legality, and as the lake sat there unchanged, reflecting clouds that didn't care who claimed what, I understood that the lesson they were about to learn would not come from arguments or meetings, but from consequences, the kind that don't smile, don't laugh, and don't go away when dismissed. 3 days later, just as the morning fog was lifting off the water, and the lake looked calm enough to pretend none of this nonsense existed, patrol cars rolled in slow and deliberate, tires crunching on gravel like punctuation at the end of a sentence. The HOA thought they were writing, red and blue lights, flashing not urgently, but officially, the kind of presence meant to intimidate rather than respond. And I already knew exactly who had made the call and exactly what story they had told, because people who believe confidence equals authority always assume law enforcement will simply enforce their version of reality, and the officers stepped out measured and neutral, hands resting casually near their belts, eyes moving from the shoreline to the posted boundaries to me, and one of them explained that a complaint had been filed alleging I was unlawfully blocking access to a community resource. The phrase delivered carefully, as if it had been rehearsed by someone who had said community several times for emphasis, and I didn't argue, didn't react, didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded and said I understood why they were there, then walked to my truck and retrieved the folder I had prepared days earlier, because escalation was never a question of if, but when, and inside that folder was everything that mattered, the recorded survey showing metes and bounds drawn with unforgiving precision. Deed transferred and recorded properly with the lake clearly included, the title insurance letter affirming ownership and insung against exactly this kind of manufactured dispute, and I handed the documents over one by one, not dramatically, just matter of fact, because facts don't need thutter, and the officers took them and began to read, really read, not the skim people do when they're waiting to argue, but the focused attention of professionals who understand that paper outranks opinions. And the longer they read, the quieter the scene became, the lights still flashing but suddenly stripped of their intended effect, because authority shifts when clarity enters the room, and after a few minutes one officer looked up, then back down, tracing a boundary line with his finger, then exchanged a glance with his partner that said everything without words, and he asked a single, simple question that cut through weeks of posturing like a blade. Do they have an easement? Not sarcastic. Not confrontational, just procedural, because easements are the hinge upon which access swings, and I answered honestly and plainly, no, there is no recorded easement, no prescriptive easement, no implied access, nothing, and I could almost feel the entire HOA narrative collapse under the weight of that one missing document. Because without an easement there is no right of passage, no shared use, no community entitlement, only trespass dressed up as tradition, and the officer nodded once, handed the documents back, and said that settled it, explaining that without an easement or ownership claim, access could not be enforced, and any further entry without permission would be a civil matter at best, and potentially criminal at worst if warnings were ignored. And there was no argument, no back and forth, no lecture directed at me, because there was nothing to lecture about, and one officer added that they would note the outcome of the calls so future complaints would reference the same determination. A quiet but powerful sentence that effectively ended the tactic of weaponizing patrol cars, and just like that the conversation ended, no tickets issued, no warnings to me, no demands to reopen access, just a polite acknowledgement that the law had spoken and it had not stuttered. And as they returned to their vehicles, the imbalance of the situation became almost absurd. Weeks of emails, meetings, signs, threats, and board votes undone by a few pages of recorded reality and a single question asked by someone who actually understood jurisdiction. And when the cars pulled away and the lights disappeared down the road, the lake returned to silence, unchanged, indifferent, still reflecting the sky like it always had. And I stood there realizing that the HOA's greatest mistake hadn't been calling the police. It had been assuming the police would care about their wishes more than the law. Because authority doesn't come from clipboards or committees or how long someone has gotten away with something. It comes from what is written, recorded, and enforceable. And from that moment forward, the dynamic shifted completely, because they had played their strongest card and it had failed publicly and decisively. And there is no recovering from that kind of loss of credibility, especially when it's documented in a call log. And I knew then that everything that followed would be quieter, more careful, less arrogant, because once the question of easement had been asked and answered, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to threaten, nothing left to handle. And the lake, which had never belonged to the community, no matter how often they said it, finally belonged to silence again, the kind of silence that only comes when reality reasserts itself and entitlement has nowhere left to stand. The HOA called an emergency meeting, an event so sudden and orchestrated it was clear the board had spent hours coordinating the timing, choosing the room, arranging chairs like a courtroom without the judge, and drafting an agenda that leaned heavily on vague phrases like community interest and shared resources, in the hope that the sheer weight of formal-looking documents would intimidate me, confident that numbers could somehow enforce authority, that the collective presence of familiar faces could create a psychological barrier, that I would be overwhelmed by polite nods and murmured agreement. And so I attended quietly, arriving a few minutes early, taking the seat closest to the door, hands folded, demeanor neutral, prepared to observe before speaking, because when conflict is imminent, listening first often disarms overconfidence. And as more members filtered in, greetings were exchanged, small talk attempted, chairs scraped along the floor. And I noticed the subtle body language. Crossed arms, sideways glances, brief whispers, a silent understanding that they had the numbers, but not necessarily the law. And when the meeting finally began, the HOA president called it to order with a practiced authority, introducing the discussion about the lake and access, the tone dripping with assumed control, and one by one, board members spoke, recounting history as if repetition could manufacture ownership, each tale emphasizing years of community use, summer barbecues, children wadding in the shallows, memories that carried weight for them but no legal standing, and they leaned heavily on this argument, confident that sentiment could outweigh fact, that nostalgia could somehow override a recorded deed, and I let them speak, letting their voices rise and fall, nodding occasionally to acknowledge hearing without conceding. And when it was my turn, I calmly countered, citing the law, the precise wording of the property deed, survey markers, county records, and the title insurance letter, documents they could not argue with. And I explained that ownership and rights are not granted by consensus or tradition, but by legal instruments recorded in perpetuity. And I watched as their confident expressions faltered ever so slightly, a subtle crack in the armor of assumed authority, but they were prepared, at least in their minds, for counterarguments, so they shifted to fairness, framing the lake as a communal resource. Agwung that moral and social considerations should temper my strict legal rights, that denying access would be unneighborly, that community norms carried weight that documents could not capture, and I countered again with precision, pointing out that fairness has limits when weighed against law, that precedent cannot arise from casual habit, that permissive use does not equate to easement or ownership, that the only fairness recognized in property disputes is the fairness codified by law. And I could see frustration growing, a subtle trembling in the hands of one board member, a furrow deepening in the president's brow, because each argument they had rehearsed was neutralized by evidence. Each appeal to emotion met with quiet, unshucked fact, and when the conversation escalated, they shifted tactics again, now moving toward threat, legal action to force the lake open, to challenge my authority, to create a narrative of oppression that could be wielded in letters and court filings. And I listened, letting the threats hang in the air like smoke, and when the pause came, I leaned forward and informed them, calmly, clearly, and without inflection, that I had already sent a certified notice revoking permissive access, warning against trespass, fully documented, sent through channels recognized by law, a notice that predated the meeting and rendered their threats ineffective, and the room, so recently alive with voices, arguments, murmurs, and confident posturing, fell silent. A silence so heavy it seemed almost tactile, pressing against the walls, the chairs, the very air, and in that silence, I could see it in their eyes. The realization that the numbers they counted on, the historical anecdotes, the appeals to fairness, the threats of legal escalation, none of it had weight against documentation, against fact, against law recorded and verified, and as the quiet stretched, the president shifted in her seat, fingers drumming nervously on the table. Other board members exchanged glances, some fidgeting, some leaning back, all grappling with the sudden collapse of their expected authority, and in that quiet, I understood that the dynamic had irrevocably changed, that intimidation through numbers could not withstand evidence, that repeated assertions of moral or communal claim were powerless when confronted with clear legal standing, and as I collected my things to leave, the room remained still, the usual chatter and murmured side conversations absent, and when the door closed behind me, leaving them with their papers, their memories, and their unfulfilled threats, the silence lingered like a message. A subtle but undeniable declaration that law, properly documented and enforced, is the final arbiter, and the lake, calm and indifferent, reflected the sky as if acknowledging that it had always been mine. And in that moment, I realized that this meeting, intended to intimidate, had instead reinforced what I had known all along. Facts endure, authority is derived from legal recognition, and those who rely on belief over evidence will eventually find themselves speaking into an echoing void of their own making. Notice was brief, precise, and unambiguous, drafted with careful attention to language so that no loophole, misinterpretation, or implied concession could undermine its authority. Every sentence constructed to convey fact rather than emotion, clarity rather than threat. Because in disputes like this, ambiguity is the weapon of the unprepared and precision is the armor of the informed, and it began by stating simply and unmistakably that no easement existed, not prescriptive, not implied. Not de facto, not any type of access based on habit, history, or tradition, because the law does not bend to comfort or popularity, only to recorded rights and formal recognition, and it clarified that no implied access applied, preempting any argument that prior usage, permissive tolerance, or communal assumption could transform into legal entitlement, a line drawn in language sharper than nails, and then it spelled out, in direct, formal terms, that any entry onto the property without explicit permission would be treated as trespass under local, state, and applicable federal statutes, with enforcement mechanisms detailed succinctly, including the imposition of fines, the potential for citations, and the exposure to civil liability for damages, ensuring that anyone reading it would understand the consequences of ignoring what was written, and that consequences were real, enforceable, and documented. Because certainty is the most effective deterrent, and I made no effort to sugarcoat, to appeal to emotion, to invoke nostalgia, or to provide any rationale other than law and property rights. And after finalizing the notice, I prepared copies for every known access point, former trails beaten down through grass, dirt paths widened by repeated foot and vehicle traffic, the edge of the tree line where kayaks had been launched, the small clearing where children had once paddled in shallow water. Every location carefully identified to ensure that no one could claim ignorance, because ignorance does not absolve liability, and I posted the notices at each point in a deliberate, methodical manner, securing them with durable fasteners, weather-resistant laminates, all positioned at eye level or slightly above, so they could not be overlooked or dismissed, each notice facing outward, visible to anyone approaching from any angle, and I made sure the wording was consistent, the formatting professional. Tone neutral, authoritative, and unmistakable, because repetition of clarity reinforces understanding in ways that argument never can. And as I stepped back from each posting, I didn't raise my voice, didn't speak to imaginary critics, didn't pause to explain, didn't negotiate or haggle or plead, because none of that was necessary when the law was on my side, and every action I took was deliberate, controlled, and in strict compliance with legal norms, because escalation, intimidation, or dramatics accomplish nothing compared to meticulous adherence to procedure, and I photographed every posting, catalogued the locations with GPS coordinates, time-stamped images, and stored them in both digital and physical folders, knowing that documentation would be critical if any claims or disputes arose, and the process took several days because precision is rarely rushed, each sign a statement of reality, a reminder of boundaries. A tangible assertion that property rights are not merely theoretical but actively recognized and enforced. And as I moved through the property, placing notice after notice, I could feel the weight of expectation shift invisibly, a subtle but undeniable change in energy, because people accustomed to informal access instinctively sense when the rules have changed, when tolerance is replaced by enforcement, when permissive entry becomes a matter of legal consequence. And I made no attempt to soften that perception, to curry favor, to seek compromise, because compromise is irrelevant when rights are clear and authority is documented. And when the last notice was posted at the farthest entry point, marking the final boundary with cold, unambiguous clarity, I stepped back and surveyed the property, the lake, the tree lines, the paths now officially closed, and I realized that the silence that followed was profound, not the absence of sound, but the presence of order. The tangible manifestation of law asserted calmly, factually, and without theatrics, a quiet authority that did not need to raise its voice to be recognized. And in that moment, I understood that power, real power, is not about yelling, negotiating, or appealing to sentiment, but about understanding the rules, applying them consistently, and documenting every step so that neither misunderstanding nor arrogance can challenge what is rightfully yours. And as I walked the perimeter one last time, signs firmly in place, corners photographed, every notice accounted for, I felt a weight lift, not triumphal or vindictive, but simply the satisfaction of order restored, boundaries respected, and the law followed exactly as it was written. Because in disputes like these, clarity, documentation, and adherence to legal authority are not just strategies. They are the only tools that withstand repeated tests of entitlement, tradition, and expectation. And in that moment, the property, the lake, and I were aligned with reality, unshaken by claims, immune to threats, and fully prepared for whatever defiance might come next, knowing that the rules, once properly applied, do not bend, do not waver, and do not need justification beyond the truth of ownership. Residents showed up anyway, drawn by habit, curiosity, or perhaps a stubborn belief that the lake belonged to them, because tradition had whispered that idea into the collective conscience for decades, and they arrived in small groups at first, walking down the dirt paths, hauling coolers, folding chairs, fishing poles, kayaks, and dogs, all of it carried with the assumption that access was their right, that the mere act of arriving conferred entitlement, and I watched quietly from the shoreline. The water still reflecting the morning sun, knowing that observation was as important as confrontation, because the way people behave when faced with boundaries tells you far more than words ever could. And as they approached the posted notices, some glanced briefly, some shrugged, and a few muttered complaints, waving their hands as if dismissing paper could erase recorded law, and I waited patiently, allowing each individual to come to the same realization I had already made clear. Trespass had consequences, documented and enforceable, because property rights are not suggestions, they are facts, and the signs did their work, visible, laminated, precise, laying out limits, responsibilities, and potential penalties. But still, some argued, raising voices that carried across the water, voices fueled by entitlement and surprise, voices attempting to override documentation with emotion, with volume, with the unshakable confidence of someone who believes, irrationally, that numbers, social pressure, or nostalgia can rewrite law, and I responded the way I always did. Calmly, factually, without anger, explaining that there was no easement, no legal precedent for access, no implied permission, and that any further attempt to enter would be treated as trespass, enforceable through citations, fines, and civil liability, because clarity and consistency are the most powerful tools when confronting willful ignorance. And yet, even after explanation, a few chose to test the boundary physically, stepping past the marked line, ignoring both signage and warning. Their actions daring me to respond, and I did, as required by law and reinforced by prior notice, issuing citations to the first violator, documenting the trespass with photographs, timestamps, GPS coordinates, and witness statements, filing the notice with the local authorities, ensuring every step was recorded, defensible, and unassailable, and as word spread through social media posts, neighborhood chats, and gossiping voices along streets and fences, the reality crystallized for everyone. The lake wasn't theirs, had never been theirs, and tradition, social pressure, or HOA assertions could not create rights where none existed, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the attitude shifted, the conversations changed, the confidence that had been built on assumed access and repeated tolerance began to erode, replaced by a cautious awareness that limits existed, that boundaries mattered, and that my enforcement was not arbitrary but legal, methodical, and deliberate, and the HOA, once convinced that authority could extend past my fence line, suddenly found itself powerless, their logos, signage, and repeated claims meaningless beyond the boundary they could not cross. And for the first time, everyone saw the limit, understood where entitlement ended and reality began, because no amount of rhetoric can create ownership where the law draws a clear line. And as residents left, muttering or grumbling, some quiet, some resentful, some enlightened, I walked the perimeter of the lake, noting where foot traffic had once pressed the soil flat, imagining where paths had been created through habit and not right, And I realized that the power of assertion is not in confrontation alone, but in consistency, in documentation, in the patient application of law. Because when rules are enforced methodically and evenly, when trespass is met with measurable consequence, the illusion of authority that once dominated becomes powerless, evaporates under scrutiny. And people begin to understand their place relative to property that is not theirs. And by the end of the day, the lake returned to the calm it had always held, undisturbed by furniture, coolers, or trespassers, reflections rippling gently across the water as if acknowledging that order had been restored, that limits were clear, and that the HOA's authority truly stopped at my fence line, a boundary they could not cross, a limit they could not enforce. And in that clarity, the lesson was visible to everyone. Entitlement is not law, confidence is not ownership, and the moment someone steps past the line, consequences follow inevitably, unarguable and documented. And for the first time, the neighborhood could see it all, and I could see it too in the empty shoreline, the quiet water, the upright signs standing like sentinels along the edge of property that had always been mine, untouched, protected, and finally, undeniably respected. The HOA tried to save face, and the effort was as transparent as it was futile, a series of carefully worded gestures meant to rewrite perception without actually addressing reality, beginning with emails that claimed misunderstandings, as if weeks of trespass, posted signage, citations, and documented notices could be dismissed by a single phrase, an attempt to shift blame onto ambiguity rather than admit that they had overstepped legal boundaries repeatedly. And the tone was almost pleading in parts. We apologize if there was any confusion. We understand there may have been miscommunication, words chosen carefully to sound conciliatory while revealing nothing of substance, the kind of language meant to mollify neighbors or observers without requiring the board to acknowledge wrongdoing or responsibility. And then came the suggestions for shared use agreements, proposals framed in bureaucratic language, letters outlining terms for joint access, conditions under which community residents might enjoy the lake, schedules for permissible use, insurance requirements, indemnification clauses, and indemnity waivers, all dressed up in legalese, as if formality alone could retroactively confer rights that never existed. And I reviewed each one with the meticulous attention the situation demanded, understanding that access can be negotiated only before entitlement is claimed. That cooperation and agreements make sense when property is shared or jointly owned, not when harassment, trespass, and repeated false claims have already taken place, because once entitlement is assumed and misused, negotiation after the fact legitimizes behavior that should never have occurred, and I declined each offer politely but firmly, citing the prior notices, the citations, the clear legal standing, emphasizing that any discussion of access could only occur on my terms, under my control. And with recognition of the boundaries that had been repeatedly ignored, and as the board digested the refusal, subtle signs of frustration emerged. Curt emails, defensive phrases, a noticeable change in posture during meetings, and a dawning realization that their narrative was no longer persuasive, no longer capable of shifting perception or undermining documented fact. And soon, their attorney, who had previously been a constant voice of caution, a buffer against escalation, stopped returning calls entirely, emails left unread, phone messages ignored, as if disengagement could somehow erase the legal reality, or at least prevent further embarrassment, leaving the board increasingly isolated in their attempts to reclaim a sense of control. And the absence of professional guidance was immediately visible in their communications, or lack thereof, because newsletters that had once carried carefully curated updates, community reminders, and friendly notices regarding lake use suddenly stopped mentioning the lake altogether, a conspicuous silence that spoke louder than any announcement could have. As if omission might erase the subject from collective memory, and in that silence, the truth was clear. The board had overreached, misjudged authority, misapplied confidence, and faced with documented legal enforcement, found themselves powerless to reverse course publicly. And the neighborhood, once accustomed to casual access and informal assumptions of entitlement, began to notice the change, the absence of reminders, the lack of coordinated events on the shoreline, the quiet void where previously there had been activity, and a subtle ruckalabrushing of understanding occurred. The lake was no longer theirs, it had never been, and authority, once assumed by a logo, a board, or historical narrative, stopped at the boundaries clearly defined by law, physically marked, and now unchallenged. And as days turned into weeks, the board's attempts at control became increasingly performative. Meetings convened with empty agenda items regarding the lake. Emails circulated vaguely about community engagement without mentioning access. Social media posts increasingly ignored the water altogether, and the realization settled into the collective consciousness that the power they had presumed was not only lost but fundamentally untransferable, because entitlement cannot exist without rights, and confidence, no matter how loud or repeated, cannot override documentation. And I watched this unfold with a careful, quiet satisfaction, not triumphant or vengeful, but simply acknowledging that law, once applied and enforced with consistency, has a gravitational pull that reshapes perception, and that when the board's narrative failed, the silence that followed was more instructive than any argument, more permanent than any meeting, more authoritative than any threat. And in that silence, the lake finally existed as it always had. Calm, protected, and beyond the reach of unearned claims, a tangible reminder that authority must be legitimate to be respected, that trespass carries consequences, and that boundaries, once properly asserted, do not bend to persuasion, nostalgia, or the desperate attempts of those unwilling to accept reality. And in that enduring quiet, the neighborhood slowly adjusted. Conversations about the lake ceased, questions dwindled, and a collective understanding emerged without fanfare. The HOA's influence ended at the line of my fence, and beyond that, law, documentation, and the simple, unyielding truth of ownership reigned supreme. Weeks passed, and with each day the tension that had hung over the property like a low cloud slowly lifted, almost imperceptibly at first, as if the land itself was exhaling after weeks of unrest. The tire tracks that had scarred the east bank disappeared under rain and new growth, the soil recovering its texture, the reeds standing upright once more, and the picnic trash that had littered the shoreline vanished, either collected by well-meaning neighbors or left to decompose naturally, leaving the banks clean, the water's edge free of human intrusion. And it was astonishing how quickly neglect and disregard fade when not reinforced by repeated trespass. And with the absence of litter, the water itself seemed to respond, clearing gradually, the murky patches settling, sediments falling to the bottom, sunlight penetrating more deeply, and suddenly the lake regained the transparency and stillness that had first drawn me to it, reflecting the trees, the sky, and the occasional cloud with an unbroken mirror-like quality, a visual affirmation that boundaries, once respected, allow ecosystems to heal, and that human conflict leaves a residue beyond politics or law, a tangible disruption that wildlife feels and reacts to. And slowly, cautiously, the animals returned. Ducks paddling along the banks, herons stalking silently at the shallow edges, fish breaking the surface with sudden arcs, and even the smaller creatures, frogs, turtles, the occasional beaver, resuming activity as though reassured that the land was once again safe and predictable, that the patterns of intrusion had ceased, that calm and consistency had returned. And I noticed how the mornings began to feel like they had before the disputes, quiet in a way that was almost profound. The soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the gentle lap of water against the shore, the distant call of birds echoing over the surface, no voices arguing, no hurried footsteps along the paths, no signs of confrontation or defiance, only the rhythm of nature uninterrupted. And in that quiet, I realized the true value of what I had purchased extended beyond ownership. It was the right to preserve, protect, and manage, to assert boundaries and ensure that peace and order were maintained, to create a space where intrusion was neither expected nor permitted, and where respect was not requested but inherently understood, a concept that takes time to root but grows strong once established. And as I walked the perimeter, observing the reflections in the water, noting the gentle sway of reeds and the quiet return of animal life, I felt a sense of accomplishment that had little to do with confrontation and everything to do with restoration. Because property, like the ecosystems it contains, thrives under stewardship, not under contested occupation. And it became clear that the lake, now free from the repeated claims and casual trespass, had achieved its natural state of balance, a private sanctuary shielded from the assumptions and misunderstandings of those who had previously believed access was theirs by virtue of habit, tradition, or administrative fiat. And each morning, as the sunlight spread across the water, I watched mist rise off the surface, creating ephemeral patterns that danced with the light, the air rich with the scent of wet earth and water plants, and in those moments, the old mill lake became exactly what I had intended it to be. Private, protected, and respected, a space in which boundaries were recognized, peace was restored, and the law was silently honored without argument or enforcement needed, because the establishment of limits had allowed the property to breathe, to function, to return to its intended purpose. And in that return to equilibrium, I found not only satisfaction, but a profound understanding of the power of clarity, documentation, and consistent application of rights. That the assertion of ownership need not be allowed to be effective, that the simple act of upholding boundaries reshapes behavior over time, that trespassers retreat when consequences are clear and enforced, and that nature, left to respond without human conflict, thrives in ways that are both immediate and enduring, and as the sun rose higher each morning, scattering light across the still water and the trees lining the banks, the lake existed not as a contested resource, not as a battleground for entitlement or authority, but as the sanctuary it was meant to be, a quiet testament to the principle that private property, when protected, is more than land. It is peace, continuity, and respect manifested in physical and legal reality, and I could walk its perimeter, observe its wildlife, and hear only the natural symphony of water and wind, a living reminder that the struggle for recognition, though exhausting, had been worth every step, every notice. Every boundary asserted, because weeks after the last confrontation, the old mill lake had finally been returned to its true state, untroubled, secure, and sovereign under its rightful ownership, a private refuge where the law, the land, and the peace of the mornings converged perfectly, and where I, as the steward, could finally witness the fulfillment of what I had purchased, not merely as property, but as a restored, protected, and respected sanctuary. Ownership isn't about who used something the longest, a lesson that seems simple in theory, but is often obscured by habit, expectation, and the false sense of entitlement that grows over time when repeated access is treated as permission, because people are naturally inclined to believe that familiarity and repeated presence create rights, that tradition can outweigh documentation, and that numbers, confidence, and social reinforcement somehow confer authority, and yet, as I had learned firsthand, none of these things actually establish ownership in any legal sense. The law does, and the law is impartial, precise, and indisputable when properly documented, recorded, and enforced, and that understanding is often difficult for those who confuse usage with entitlement, who assume that repeated enjoyment of a resource translates into a claim they can wield against the legitimate owner, because human psychology clings to what feels natural rather than what is legally recognized, and the HOA, like many who rely on assumptions over documentation, had spent weeks acting as though their perception of control could override the reality recorded in the county's records, confident that numbers, history, and social pressure could substitute for fact. And it took just one legal notice to upend all of that, one carefully worded, precise, and unambiguous document stating that no easement existed, that no implied permission applied, and that any entry without consent would be treated as trespass, enforceable through fines, citations, and civil liability, a notice that spoke with the authority of law rather than the volume of emotion, the effectiveness of shouting, or the weight of community opinion, because in property disputes, words unbacked by law carry no force, and the irony of the situation was that everything the HOA had attempted, signage, threats, appeals to tradition, emergency meetings, email campaigns, and attempts at negotiation after trespass, failed precisely because they lacked legal foundation. And the moment the notice was posted, clarity entered the situation in a way that shouting never could, in a way that authority without legitimacy could never achieve, because facts, once documented and enforced, create consequences that cannot be ignored without risk, and the HOA quickly discovered the uncomfortable truth that authority ends where the law does, that committee votes, board meetings, and moral appeals cannot extend rights beyond the boundary of recorded ownership, that confidence and assertiveness are meaningless against documentation and procedure, and that history, sentiment, and repetition cannot generate legal entitlement where none exists, and as residents were turned away, citations issued to trespassers, and the lake slowly returned to calm, the lessons sank in. Repeated behavior does not equal ownership, persuasion does not equal law, and threats without foundation carry no weight. a realization that was visible not only in the resignation on board members' faces, but in the silence that followed, in the absence of further confrontation, in the cessation of newsletters referencing access, and in the halting of attorney communications, all signals that the HOA had accepted, whether gracefully or begrudgingly, that their assumed authority had limits they could not surpass, and in the aftermath, the lake itself reflected the restoration of order, the still water mirroring the surrounding trees, the sky, and the quiet ripples of wildlife resuming their natural rhythms. The property no longer a contested arena, but a controlled, protected environment, a private sanctuary under clear legal ownership. And in that restored calm, I realized that one clear, legally enforceable notice had accomplished more than months of debate, confrontation, and attempts at persuasion could have, because the law, unlike argument or emotion, does not bend to confidence or habit, and ownership, unlike assumed rights, is defined, documented, and enforceable, and the HOA had learned a lesson that many never do. That authority is granted by law, not assumed, and that attempts to extend control beyond legal limits are futile, visible only as frustration and public embarrassment. And as I walked along the shoreline, observing the reflections in the water, noting the return of fish and birds, listening to the gentle lapping of waves against the bank, I understood the deeper principle reinforced by the experience. Peace and order in property management are maintained not through conflict, shouting, or social pressure, but through clarity, documentation, and consistent enforcement of rights. And when those elements are in place, compliance is achieved naturally, without drama, without negotiation after trespass, and without further escalation. And the lake, once the center of dispute, finally had one owner, one authority recognized by both law and action, one clear boundary respected by neighbors, and in that recognition, the property found peace, a peace grounded not in intimidation, not in persuasion, not in agreement or friendship, but in the undeniable certainty of legal rights exercised correctly, and that peace mirrored in the calm waters, the returning wildlife and the quiet mornings was absolute, unchallenged, and permanent, a testament to the principle that true ownership is measured not by volume, numbers, or sentiment, but by documented right, and the authority that accompanies it, and in that truth. The HOA, the residents, and I all witnessed the simple, enduring reality. Control ends at the limit of the law, trespass carries consequence, and when boundaries are asserted with clarity and enforced consistently, peace and respect naturally follow, and the old mill lake, finally free from misunderstanding, trespass, and misplaced authority, existed precisely as it should, private, protected, respected, and unequivocally mine.